Hello, everybody. I'm Brian Levine, and welcome to the Gould Standard, a podcast brought to you by the Glenn Gould Foundation. And we're here once again bringing you conversations with some of the most remarkable people from all across the world of the arts. If music, novels, poetry, film, visual art, theater, and multimedia creations are the indispensable spice in your life, well, then you have come to the right place, my friends. But first, while you're stopping by under our fantastic flickering neon piano sign, please do take a moment to press like, share, and subscribe. And do feel free to post your comments, ask your questions, and be part of our community of friends and supporters. And if you would like to find more wonderful information, please visit our website, glenngould.ca. When you're there, if you are seized by an absolutely irresistible impulse to press the ever-present donate button, well, we would be honored to have you as a supporter. We are a registered Canadian charity, and we rely on the generous donation of friends like you. So, today we are thrilled, really thrilled, to present something extraordinary and special. And to do it, a good friend of Glenn Gould's and a very, very dear friend of the Glenn Gould Foundation, a Pulitzer Prize-winning critic, educator, distinguished author, and all-around wonderful person in and around the world of music and the arts, Tim Page. Tim, thank you for joining us.
Oh, it's such a pleasure. It's very nice to see you again.
It's always a joy to see you, Tim. And I should say that the purpose of this gathering is to present something that you very generously shared with us, a really irreplaceable and one-of-a-kind piece of archival history, I guess you would say, audio history. And it is a recording. For people who have ever wondered what it would be like to get one of those mysterious middle-of-the-night phone calls from Glenn Gould, or just to have been able to listen in, well, we're not presenting exactly that, but something along the same lines. And Tim, can you kind of cue up how the recording that we're about to hear came to be?
I'd be delighted to. Basically, what happened was it was Glenn Gould's 25th anniversary with CBS Masterworks, as it was known then. It's now CBS Sony. When Glenn signed up, it was Columbia Masterworks, but then it was CBS Masterworks. And he put out a notice that he would be giving a few interviews. But in typical Glenn style, he insisted that the person contact him first and just give some idea of what might come up in the talk. And I was not really a professional reporter then. Reporters in general never agree to limit themselves in subjects. And it wasn't so much a limitation as he wanted to know how our brains worked and whether we'd actually have something to talk about. So I wrote him a note and I said I wanted to talk about Strauss. I wanted to talk with him about his ideas on radio. I wanted to talk to him about his idea of North. And I joined the queue of people who sent him notes. He finally gave 2 interviews for this, I believe. He gave one to Lawrence Shames from Esquire magazine, and then he agreed to talk to me. And I was as you'll soon hear, I was a barely 26-year-old kid. And I was thrilled because I'd been a Gould fan for a long, long time. And the idea that he was going to talk to me at my little arts weekly magazine, the SoHo News, which I think at our peak, we reached about 30,000 people, almost all of them in New York and mostly in downtown New York. And so he agreed. And so we tried to set it up. And we finally did on a Saturday night. I don't remember the date right now, but it was late October, 1980. And I've sent you the date, so it'll be on this. But we tried to set it up at the radio station up at Columbia, and it didn't work. So I went out on the street and I bought one of these little things you could put on the back of your phone for about $1.99 or something. And he called me person to person, and I just recorded it on my phone. And, as you will hear, the sound is not great, but you will hear a couple of things. Number one, you'll hear the beginning of what became a friendship until Glenn died. And this is the first time I'd talked with him at all seriously. But what you will hear, and what I think really makes this important, and I want to thank you for your kind words introducing this, and I will actually, for once, agree with a superlative about something I've done. Because when I found this and listened to it again for the first time in many, many years, it struck me that I don't think, to the best of my knowledge, there is no other recording of Glenn just talking on the phone, and he's not doing what he often did and having a script prepared and talking about this. Is entirely unscripted. And it was obvious within 10 or 15 minutes, you can really practically hear it happened, that we liked each other a lot and we made each other laugh. And so the talk, which was supposed to be a half hour, went on to, what is it, close to 2 hours, I think?
Almost 2 hours, yes.
Almost 2 hours. And it's very exciting to hear it again, because this is the Glenn I remember. And of course, I had dozens more of these talks with him, but you don't record your friends, you know? This was done for an interview, and after that, of course, I never recorded anything that we talked about. But this is pretty close, because we were friends pretty quick, and I asked him my questions, and he came up with his answers, and I think the listener will have a great deal of fun with this. And this is really what Glenn was like. So I'm glad that I found it, because I've moved so many times, and now I'm back right in the same place where it was recorded in New York City. And anyway, I found it, and I thought, wow, I'm going to give this to the Glenn Gould people, and here we are.
Great. So, without further ado, here we go.
First of all, I'd really like to thank you tremendously for this interview. It means an awful lot to me.
My pleasure. And once again, I apologize for all the kerfuffle yesterday. It just really couldn't be helped at the time, I think, but I'm sorry it stopped your schedule.
I hope everything got on.
Not really, but we settled something, so it was not entirely unproductive in that last bad hour.
Okay, well, I think this is better anyway. There's one other thing. I may, for a second, have to put you on hold, but that's just only for a second at one point.
Sure.
Because somebody may be calling in on this number. I should have had you call another one, but I'll just get them off immediately.
I can... well, wait a minute, how can they call this number?
Well, it's a special thing they have called the call waiting system. They don't have that in Toronto yet?
Not that I know of.
It's a very special sort of thing. It allows an incoming call to come into the house, and you'll hear a little beep, and you can press down the receiver and take that call and say, I'll call you back later tomorrow, which is exactly what I will do. But I do have to take that at one point.
Well, look, do you want me? Would it be simpler if I simply call you back on another...
No, I think this would be best, because I'm all set up on this phone now. So there really probably shouldn't be any interruption.
I am a little curious about your colleague who may or may not ask questions later on.
His name is Paul Alexander, and he's studied your career to a great degree, and was one of the people who was instrumental in not introducing me to your recordings, but in introducing me to certain recordings which I had missed. I think he's followed and read just about every scrap of material on you, and has lent it to me. So, anyway, well, I want this to be a different interview than usual. I've already promised not to drag out all the silly questions that you've been plagued with so often, but there's bound to be some duplication of maybe some of the material which you've done, as a lot of my readers won't have read them. So I'll start off with one. It's now about 16 years since you left the concert stage, am I correct?
Yep.
I'm not going to ask you why you left or whether you will return, as you've answered both questions really quite eloquently.
As far as I know, I have answered them as fully as I can. I should just tell you, parenthetically, however, that in next month's anniversary album, I do stage an hysteric return.
I've heard that recording. I'm going to talk to you. I think it's a magnificent piece of work.
That took up 2 months of in fact, it took up my entire summer.
It's absolutely a splendid piece of work, and I want to go rather deeply into that.
Splendid. I didn't realize that you were aware of it.
Yes, Susan Kosas at CBS sent me a copy of it.
Oh, very good. I rather suspect that, I don't know, what she sent you, a cassette or?
Yes, cassette. I've been listening to it on this awful little cassette player I have. I can't wait to hear another stereo.
Okay. Well, I know that in the, I'm glad she did send you, in fact, a copy of the acetates that they had, because they were getting some groove echo problems, and the Theodore on the left was splashing over to Marta on the right, and vice versa, and so they were trying to correct for that. So I'm glad you did hear it.
I want to ask you exactly who you played in that. You played
I played Theodore, Karl-Heinz, Sir Nigel, naturally the chairman of the board, and Duncan Hay Guinness. The male voice that was not mine was that, of course, the announcer Byron Rossiter, who is played by an announcer at the CBC really named Bill Hawes, who does a magnificent impersonation of Milton Cross, I think. And I told him that there would come a time when we would find a way of immortalizing that particular impersonation, and I think we did it. And so, all of the other male parts I played. The Duncan Hay Guinness character was a debut. All of the other voices I've done before, not always under those names. Karl-Heinz has been around under his name for many years, both in television and radio. I've used him a number of times. He's mellowed over the years. I don't know. I don't imagine you've seen the program, though.
No, I haven't.
Unfortunately, I'm at my studio now, and I don't have them here. But I have written alleged biographical data, very much in the style of the material itself, drawing on. Well, for example, we talk at some length about Klopweiser's career in Greenland and so on and so on. And in any event, made up some rather delightful fantasies about what the characters, might have had in their background and what is forthcoming for them, and so on and so on. Anyway, it was mad fun. The other thing I should tell you is that every line, or every speech at any rate, in that entire thing was stitched together like a film. We naturally, of course, knew we had to do that with my speeches, but what we didn't know at the time we started to do it was that my studio, which is strictly a post-production facility and not intended to be a recording studio in any sense, and which had never been used as a recording studio before, was fine as long as we opened only one mic. When we opened a second mic, as we did when Margaret arrived to do her bit, and we felt that, we would tape whatever sequences she had of 2 or 3 or more lines, together consecutively with one of the characters. When we opened a second mic, it picked up an ice-making machine. My studio was in a hotel, and it picked up an ice-making machine for the staff cafeteria, which was 1.5 doors away. We can't hear it. Well, if you stand in a certain way now, you can, but we couldn't hear it at that time, and there was absolutely nothing we could do about it. So literally, if she says, it's terribly hot in here, and I say it's terribly cold in here, that might have been said a week apart, So nothing was there in sequence.
Oh, that's very interesting.
The entire thing was done as a film, and shot by shot, literally. In some cases, I would record certain of my materials, play it for her, or so that she would get the inflection that I was using, and then she would respond in kind. But absolutely nothing was done in sequence.
Oh, that's fascinating, because it does work. It holds together very well.
I think it does. What I like about it really is that in the context of a completely mad, incongruous setting, very serious things get said, and that's why I indicated to Susan way back that she should not regard this as a, as a joke, which it's rather easy to describe it as being, but.
Oh, yeah, it answers a lot of your critics and espouses a great deal of your philosophy. And at the same time, it is, as you mentioned, very, very funny. I mean, I've known people like that dogmatic Marxist, and I know so many people like Theodore Slutz.
Well, I mean, Theodore's a pretty bright guy, and I'm pretty sure you do like with the SoHo News, you probably would run into Theodore's type quite often. Matter of fact, tell you the truth, in his biographical data, and believe me, I didn't think of the SoHo News at the time, it is indicated that he's the fine arts critic of the village grass is greener. Well, I think they mentioned that. Yeah, that's right. Margaret does mention that. But anyway, he's been there for some years, And he tells you the truth, he used to be rather hostile to me when he appeared first in my programs. But over the years, he's mellowed quite a bit, The same is true of Club Files, really. Nigel never much really cuts me, But anyway. I must just tell you about the Duncan character. That's a debut. I had used a Scotch accent a couple of times, but Duncan Haig, we invented especially for the occasion. I felt that he really ought to be presiding over the ceremonies and be an utterly incompetent CBC-type producer. Not that all CBC-type producers are utterly incompetent, but anyway, the problem was how to get him to splash into the studio as though poised at his talkback, in a glass case above the rest of the assembly. And so I thought, for Duncan, I can't use my studio. I'll go down to a rock studio, which I'd worked in occasionally before for special effect, where I was quite sure they would have a very sophisticated talkback system, and would simply record Duncan's voice spilling into the studio from the control room. Went down and did this, and it seemed to be okay at the time. Brought it back and listened to it. It was all right. It wasn't gifted with any great flair, but it was okay. Didn't have any zip, however. And Jean Sarrazin, the technician who primarily worked on the show, said, I bet you we can get a better result right here because you have the most Mickey Mouse talkback button on your own control board I have ever seen. And I said, really, I've never had occasion to use it because we don't record here. And he said, oh yeah, it's really terrible. It makes a clunking sound if you try to move it. And so I did, and it did. And he said, no, why don't we put the speaker out in the corridor, and we'll put a microside recording. So we did, and it was very, very much better than what we've got in the rock studio, but it still didn't have the halo of resonance that I wanted. And I said, wait a minute, why couldn't we put the speaker in the bathroom, right up against the glass, and put the mic in front of it? And that's what we did, and that is how we got this magnificent sound of Duncan. Who I must say really does steal every scene he's in, as far as I'm concerned. I think it's very effective.
Yeah, I think so too. I think in some ways it might have been sort of a blessing in disguise that you had to do it piece by piece, because there's a sense of nervousness, and especially since you're supposed to be so anxious during the interview, and you get that feeling, perhaps partially because it was done in such different situations.
Mm-hmm. There was one horrendous day when I lost Klopfeiser's character, in terms of his voice, really, and his character as well. It went with it. I don't know what got into me, but I had done at that point about 50% of his material, and I was working my way with all the characters sequentially through, which turned out not to be a very smart idea, but at that, up to then, it seemed like a smart idea, and I suddenly got to the entire sequence having to do with Solitude Trilogy, which Klopfeiser has a great deal to say about, and when we started to cut it in, it had a hysterical tinge. He had suddenly become a kind of mad Bavarian instead of a rather more gemütlich Viennese, which he really is. And it was absurd. It didn't fit with the rest of his character at all. So we had to redo all of that. But there were moments like that where, well, during that whole period, I must say, I don't think there was a night when my dreams didn't reflect the persona that take place.
Those must have been interesting dreams. To return for a moment back to the idea of when you left the concert hall, you stated, as I say, I'm not going to ask you why you left or whether you will return, but when you did quit the performance routine, you stated rather unequivocally, if I remember, that you felt that the concert hall was dead, not just for yourself, but basically dead, and that recordings were what was in the future. in 1980, it seems that there's sort of been a major return to the concert hall, say with the smash success of the Mostly Mozart Festival here in New York and the chamber music concerts. Record industry seems to be in trouble. Do you have any second thoughts on this, or do you still feel...
I did give myself the hedge of saying by the year 2000, didn't I? So I've still got 20 years to go. By that time, I will be too old to be bothered giving interviews, and therefore I won't have to be responsible for my bad prognoses. It does seem as though the concert isn't going to go away as fast as I rather hoped it would, for the sake of all mankind, hoped it would. But as far as the recording thing, recording being in trouble, I think that's cyclical. I'm not unoptimistic about the future of recording in a classical medium, that is. First of all, it's not really in trouble in the countries where classical music means a great deal, in Germany, for example, in German-speaking countries, in Japan. This is, to a large extent, a North American trouble, and that's been coming on quite gradually but consistently for some years now, and it may or may not reverse itself. If it does not, it simply means that North Americans are not tremendously interested in classical music, I suppose. You know? But as far as the concert is concerned, it most certainly has not gone away. It has, however, changed, I think. I haven't been to a concert since 1967. That was the last time I attended one, and that was under pressure just because a friend was giving a concert in town. My impression is, from what I pick up in local papers and so on, that a great many concerts, certainly not all, I mean, they're the same sort of very conventional symphony concerts that were in my day, but there are also a great many concerts that seem rather like reincarnated versions of the kinds of acts that Hans van Bülow did when he came to this continent in the 1880s, or whatever it was, and in Toronto anyway, played the Appassionata Sonata immediately following a trained horse act. I'm not kidding. And indeed, there was a marvelous report in the Toronto, we now call it the Globe Mail. In those days, there was the Toronto Globe and the Toronto Mail. It was in one of those two things. I'm not sure which it was, but in any case, whichever it was, in their musical or cultural society column, they had a Mr. Doddington, who was the critic and or society reporter at that time, and he said something to the effect that Toronto has seldom seen so spirited and authentic a Beethoven rendition as was given last evening at St. Lawrence Hall. We have also seldom seen such an atrocious display of bad manners as was meted out by Maestro van Bülow to his hostess, Mrs. So-and-so, who turned out to be the leading social lioness at the time, when I can't remember her name. Apparently, she planned a reception for the leading members of the cast, presumably expeding the trained horses. And he, van Bülow, was so upset to find himself playing the Appassionata immediately after the trained horse act. Whether or not they had left their marks on stage, I don't know. But anyway, he declined to come. And the closing line of the review was something to the effect, the loss was his, for no one in this city keeps a finer table than Mrs. Whatever her name was. So I do notice somehow that there is a return to that kind of trained horse act concert where a bit of this and a bit of that occurs, which I think is very nice, because very often if one sits down to play records of an evening, you certainly don't play string quartets all night necessarily, unless you happen to be particularly, moved to do that.
A sort of contemporary vaudeville, you mean?
Yes, exactly. I mean, I think that certainly 20 years ago, there were very, very few flexible chamber group type concerts. You had a string quartet doing 3 Beethoven quartets or whatever, but there was not the intermingling of somewhat interchangeable modules as seems to now exist in a lot of concerts. At least there seem to be a lot of concerts of that type that exist here, and I think probably elsewhere too. So that's changed. I'm not sure whether that is a sign of desperation, i.e. the solo act can't quite sustain an audience for an entire evening or whatever, or whether it's just a more imaginative way of presenting things, or whether it's a complete return to the 1880s or whatever. But that does seem to be new, or relatively new. But I'm not sure what significance it has.
And also, perhaps when I spoke a moment ago, I spoke too much in an economic sense, because certainly in an artistic sense, the recording world is in no trouble whatsoever. I mean, I think we have more comprehensive recordings today of just about any piece you could want to hear, which is, I think, very important.
Right.
And let me talk a little bit about your repertoire for a moment. You have eschewed the standard repertoire in favor of, you haven't entirely eschewed it, obviously, because of the works of Beethoven, etc., but do you ever think you will make a... I understand why you avoided works by, say, somebody like Rachmaninoff, but do you ever think you'll make a Chopin record?
For the same reason that I wouldn't make a Rachmaninoff record. I don't think he's a very good composer. My one and only professional contact with Chopin, professional that is, because during my student years I had to play all that stuff, was the B-minor sonata, which I played just for kicks once on the CBC in a radio broadcast, and I just thought I should see once in my life what it felt like to play a Chopin major work. And it didn't feel very good, and I decided never again. Columbia were determined at that time that I was going to go and record it, and I said, no way, once is quite enough. I have always felt that the whole center core, if you like, of the piano recital repertoire, Chopin, Liszt, Schumann, I'm tempted not to say Mendelssohn because I have a tremendous affection for the choral works and the chamber works and so on of Mendelssohn, but nevertheless his piano writing is pretty bad. But I've always felt that the central recital core, Schubert of course, is a colossal waste of time. That first of all, those people really didn't write very well for the piano, with the exception of Chopin, who certainly did have a great player, but no question of that. But that the rest of them really didn't, mainly because they labored under the delusion that the piano is a homophonic instrument, and I don't think it is. I think it's a contrapuntal instrument. And for me, the piano really only becomes interesting when it's treated in a manner, whatever the idiom may be, in a manner in which the vertical and the horizontal dimensions are mated, And that certainly is not true of most of material written for it in the first half of the 19th century. In the second half of the 19th century, there lies for me the great tragedy, because the people in that period, Wagner, certainly, Strauss, Mahler maybe, but I would question that based on the little bit of piano writing he did do. But nevertheless, those two and presumably others who really could have written with a tremendous penetration of the harmonic and thematic language intermingling, just chose basically not to write for the piano at all. Wagner, as you know, wrote a couple of sonatas very early on, which make Weber look like one of the great masters of all time by comparison. But I suspect really that Wagner had no notion of how to write for the piano, in fact, because when he wrote the Bass and Dog song accompaniments later on, they're really not very good either. They're fine when they're transcribed. And these are things that he wrote when he was 16. Some of them written at 15. They are minor miracles. They are as refined, as polished as anything that Mendelssohn in the best of his teenage years did. I mean, it's the same kind of incredible prodigal gift, which does not mean they're profound statements. They're not, But although I will say that the first movement of the sonata, which incidentally has his prevailing mode of pa-pa-pa-pa sort of thing. But nevertheless, the first movement of the sonata has one of the great developments in sonata allegro history. And this, he wrote it at 16. It has a rather repetitious recapitulation and a rather literal one. But nevertheless, there are moments in that piece that are absolutely extraordinary. And all of it has such a polish, such a finish, that it's really extraordinary, and all of it lies magnificently under the fingers. It works, and at the same time, it is a really integrated piece of music. I mean, it really makes sense as a piece of keyboard writing. And it is just, for me, a great shame that a man like Strauss, who obviously as he proved again in the burlesque and later on in the bourgeois chanson piano part, and most particularly in things such as the accompaniments to the late songs, like the Ophelia songs, could write superbly for the piano, and without any ostentation, without any exhibitionism, without any kind of fake virtuosity or the need of it, that he just didn't choose to do so. I think that, that is a great pity, and to me the great gap in piano repertoire, and a really very serious one, irreparable in a sense, is that the late romantics, they plotted beneath their dignity, I suppose, to bother, that the late romantic period was an orchestral period, with orchestral sonorities in everybody's ears, and the piano really was a backup substitute, you do your first draft on it kind of instrument, and so as a consequence, if there were 16 concertos and 32 sonatas by Richard Strauss, I would play all of them. I'd record all of them. As devotedly as Sir George Solti records the Mahler symphonies, you can be sure. It's simply that the composers that I really am interested in the late romantic period were not interested in the piano, and therefore there's nothing around to play, which is why I transcribed some Wagner a few years ago.
It's too bad that really the only piano piece I can think of by Strauss, which is still at least marginally in the repertoire, is the early Traumerei.
Is that from Opus...
I think that's from Opus 5.
Opus 5 is not. This must be Opus 9, which I don't even know. There are piano pieces, Opus 3 and Opus 9, that are of a intermezzo-like nature, and I recorded the Opus 3, which are fairly sturdy pieces. They don't include a Traumerei. They don't have names as such, but the Opus 9 do, and I'll bet you that's where that is. Opus 9 are weaker pieces.
It was found in a lot of the early collections, the masterpieces of piano, Theodore Presser type collections. Yeah. What I'm also interested in is your love of Strauss. I have a sort of interest in Strauss, which and a vision of Strauss, which is sometimes, I think, not shared by a lot of people, which is I'm very fond of the magnificent, sort of serene and nostalgic and really ultimately classical part of Strauss, the late work, something like the oboe concerto, or an opera like Capriccio, which I know you've transcribed, the opening sextet and the final scene. And I would also include a work like the opera Daphne, which a lot of people treat as if it's not an important work, and I think it's a very important work, and also Metamorphosen.
Oh, absolutely. I did a documentary about Strauss last year. It was finished last year. It was actually started a couple of years before, in which we explored a lot of those works and talked about them with people like Norman Del Mar, who, as you know, is one
the three-volume book.
And the late John Culshaw, and Wolfgang Sawallisch, Wolfgang Fortner, and people like that. And it was fascinating in a way that the most devout Strauss worshippers that I interviewed and ultimately put them together, much as I did in the anniversary disc, in a conversational format. In fact, it was a conversation piece set up to make it seem as though these 8 characters had sat down together and begun to reminisce about Strauss. Music constantly in the background. In fact, the oboe concerto at the very beginning to set the stage of reminiscence, and then having made a truncation of the oboe concerto from the first movement to the oboe to the cadenza at the end of the second movement, there's a great flashback which takes the oboe leading us to the C-sharp of its D major, and coming in on the opening pedal point A or dominant pedal point A of Macbeth, and crashes into the opening D minor thing of Macbeth, and we suddenly flash back 70 years and go back after this prologue scene.
Like what he did himself in the last of the 4 last songs.
Yes.
There's a quote from Death and Transfiguration.
Indeed. But anyway, what I was going to say was that the most devout Strauss worshippers I turned up were in the most unexpected place. They were in New York. They were people like Jonathan Cott, for example, who was very reluctant to... I don't know if you know Jonathan.
I spoke to him while I was preparing this interview, and we're going to get together. We have a lot of mutual friends.
Very nice person, and I'm sure you'll get along awfully we've actually never met. Our relationship is entirely telephonic, but we've always gotten along extremely well. He's an awfully nice, very interesting man. And he was very reluctant to give me an interview. He said, because I don't really, I'm not a Strauss expert. And I said, well, hell, it doesn't matter, because what I want to get is simply, if you like, an off-the-wall reaction to whatever I ask you, and that I know you'll give me. Just surprise me, Don't worry about whether it conforms with the textbooks or not. It doesn't matter. I've got lots of textbook types, that I can always get in Munich. But anyway, he is a fanatic Straussian of the most lyrical order, and he speaks with exactly the same reverence and enthusiasm that you do for works like Metamorphoses and the Oboe Concerto, and so it really was quite extraordinary to find that. And Stanley Silverman also I interviewed. He has some considerable reservations about Strauss as an opera man in the popular opera sense, but again, loves the late works. And it was rather extraordinary to find that the elder statesmen, people like Delmar, were saying, well, I think it's absolutely extraordinary to really consider that, given his age, he does have this autumnal, but I can't really say that it looked like a teacher I was in the same league with Salome Lecture, the great works. I always remember as a small boy being taken to Queen's Hall, hearing him conduct Don Juan and Don Quixote, and I remember thinking at the time when he was like this, and then you get somebody like Jonathan, it's going on in this most ecstatic way about these late pieces, and it was quite extraordinary, precisely the reverse of the generation gap one would expect, to be expressed in that.
It's fabulous. It's just so serene, and there's something almost Grecian about its classicism.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And even if you listen to a work, I think, like the Alpine Symphony, which has had a very bad press all its life, there are moments in that which, even though there are, that coda goes on forever, and he doesn't know how to get off that pedal point at the end, but nevertheless, there are moments in that, great long swatches indeed, which put to shame, I think, even the best of the early tone poems. It may not, as a structure altogether, stand up in quite the way that something like Till does, but nevertheless, there is a seriousness about it. However fascistic the underlying program may have been in its implication, there is a seriousness about its intent that was simply not there in the early years, and it seems to have come upon him after whatever that midlife crisis that he had was, the years after or during the First World War. Really.
Yes, because there is somewhat of a decline, I think, in the middle.
Oh, there's no question. I have never been able to really take a work like Ariadne. In fact, I'm not fond of Vostcavalier. I find it a kind of tiresome, treacly sort of piece. Interesting and very beautiful at times, but first of all, its subject matter, it's not worth the effort. And I think Strauss himself was of many minds about it, because, as you know, he started off with Ox as a central character and calling it Ox and so on, and then changed his mind, or rather Hofmannsthal changed his mind in midstream, and they didn't quite know what to do with it. And for me, the great Strauss operas certainly are obviously Salome and Electra, and then again at the very end, the Capriccio. Daphne, I don't know very well. I've only heard it once, and now that you talk about it, I must really study it, because Daphne is the one of those works that I don't know.
You can pass up Friedenthal.
Yes, I have a score of it. I've never heard it, but I have played it through the piano.
I have an old study tape of it. Also, let's move on to another person who's often called a late romantic, and again, I think it's a great simplification, and that's Jan Sibelius. Mm-hmm. Because it seems to me, especially after you get out of the first couple symphonies, I can think of very few works that are as uncompromising and austere as, say, the Fourth Symphony. Mm. And I'm interested in the fact that you record. I want to talk about the actual recording technique of that disc, because that's very interesting. But I'm also curious as to the music of Sibelius. He actually wrote quite a bit of piano music.
Yeah, A lot of it, yes. I think I counted up just out of groves or something in order to write my program notes for that album. But it turns out that if you count all the independent titles within given opus numbers, the Traumeroi, whatever, and To a Fir Tree or something, there are something like 117. I had the number at the time, but I've forgotten. It's quite amazing. And most of them, at least many that I've looked at, are obviously very, very insignificant and really not worth bothering about at all. I was fascinated with those sonatinas in particular. I never did learn that when I was that thing.
Yeah, I was avoiding that. But anyway, could we talk a little bit about your concept of north? You're known to take lengthy trips off by yourself into the North Woods. If you prefer that we skirt this and go on to...
No, not at all.
Okay.
Not at all. Well, first of all, I haven't taken any of those trips for several years now. But I think one important thing to say about all of the documentaries that I've done, or the docudramas that I've done, that relate to states of solitude, as opposed to the ones that relate to purely musical subjects, is that they do not necessarily... I'm going to write a very long essay, maybe even a book-length essay sometime, on how that trilogy came to be written and the process by which it was done, because there is a sort of a story there. But one of the things that I would have to cover if I ever did that, and I hope to, is that they do not necessarily, in every respect, reflect my own point of view. They are, at some point in their genesis, they are of a documentary mold, and the mold is broken very often, but nevertheless, it has to be observed just often enough that there has to be some sense of polarity in order to keep the action alive and to keep to function in lieu of a narrative line, really. And that means that a lot of what gets said, and prominently, and with affection sometimes, is, completely contrary to my own particular views of things. Now, that doesn't mean that the essential subject matter isn't totally appealing. It is, obviously, right? Wouldn't do a work like that. But still, not everything that happens in there, or that gets talked about, or that happens in the latecomers or whatever, is something that personally represents my own view. So I'm not sure how I should go about answering your question.
Okay. Well, let me clarify a bit. I seem to recall reading, and I'm paraphrasing now, that you once said that it was very difficult to go far north without becoming a philosopher.
Well, what I said really was that most of the people that I have met who did that, whether city slickers or not, but most were city slickers initially, and who did that, seem to end up, however, in whatever a disorganized fashion, being philosophers. And I think that there is a sense in which the complete removal of oneself from elements of curiosity, really, curiosity about how your colleagues are reacting to you. I mean, these people, the kind of types that I was dealing with were, government officials, they were university professors, and so on. They were people who had been very much exposed to a kind of collegial atmosphere at one period in their life. None of them were born living in the North. They all chose it for whatever reason, Mm-hmm. And whatever that reason may have been, and it varied from person to person to some degree, it did seem to result in their first resisting it and reaching out to establish contacts and make sure their subscriptions to the New Yorker were intact and so on. And then after a certain point, saying, no, that's really not what I came here to do or to find out about myself. And as a consequence, I found anyway that there was one exception to that. There was an anthropologist who simply went there to do his paper, did it, came back, hated it, and had no intention of going back to the bloody place again, sort of thing. But nevertheless, in general, I found that the characters who had stuck it out long enough and removed themselves from the sense of curiosity about their, how the world reacted to them, whether it was their colleagues or whatever it happened to be, had developed obviously in an extraordinary way, because in some cases, although I didn't know them before I interviewed them, and I interviewed them after they came back out, obviously, I knew people who did. All of the people in Idea of North were people suggested to me, well, with the exception of the old surveyor that I met on the train. He really was a character that I encountered up there myself. But the others were all people suggested to me by friends who knew them and had known them for some years, and who had talked to me, as they themselves later did, 3 of the 4, about this metamorphosis. But I think it is also true of any person who chooses to live in an isolated way, even if, as I think I said in one of those program notes, he lives in the heart of Manhattan. I don't think that the actual latitudinal factor is important at all. I think that we chose it as a very handy metaphor, and it is also sometimes capable of providing a helping hand in getting them out of a situation that they possibly couldn't find the energy to pry themselves loose on otherwise. But apart from that, I don't think that the latitudinal design has anything really to do with it. It may be that looking at endless flowers on the tundra during the 2 co-creative weeks in July or whatever is inspiring and all that, but I don't really think that is what made them philosophers. If indeed that's what they became, I think it was this sense that they were going to undertake something which enabled them to say, I really don't care whether my colleagues back at the University of fill in the blank or the Department of External Affairs or whatever, I really don't care what they think of this imposed solitude. I am going to do it because I'm going to discover something,
A purification process.
Yes, exactly. And I think it could have happened if they had simply locked themselves in their closet, but that might have been rather less attractive visually.
It's like closing off from stimuli.
Yes, precisely.
I see. So when you titled that docudrama "The Idea of North," you meant exactly that. Rather than North, you meant again the idea. Which,
exactly.
Oh, that's quite fascinating. Can we talk a little bit about your idea of contrapuntal radio?
Sure.
This is going to be very interesting. As a matter of fact, this interview will be on the cover of an issue which is going to have a rather large audio-video supplement.
Oh, perfect.
And they thought that this would be an interesting tie-in as well, because I mentioned that you had been involved in this. I can completely, when I listen to what I have heard of the idea of North, and I must find a way of getting some complete copies.
Oh, I'll get you a copy of the disc. I'll get your address after we...
oh, that'd be splendid, because I really... also, before we get off again, I will have about 3 weeks before this needs to be prepared. Could we talk one time in about 2 weeks just to clear up a few things, which I'm sure will come up while I'm writing?
Certainly.
Great, thank you. I hear exactly what you're talking about when you talk about, or what I assume to be what you're talking about when you mention Contrapuntal Radio. And when I listen to the beginning of your docudrama with the people all speaking at once, I can hear it as almost a musical subject. But I'm wondering how you would suggest to somebody who doesn't automatically understand it and will say, well, I can't hear every word they're saying. How would you ask them to listen to such a work?
Well, it would be nice if I had the technique and the ability to make them hear every word, assuming that they're really going to concentrate and try to do that. But I don't, as I said in the the articles that I wrote about North at the time was done, I don't honestly believe that it is, in some cases, essential that every word is heard in the same degree of clarity that one would expect to hear it in a purely linear fashion. There are moments when, quite deliberately, one suppresses one voice to another, and one gives the very clear idea of what that character is in a given situation likely to be saying. One emphasizes by pulling the pod or boosting the pod, rather, just enough key words within the counter-subject sentences, if you will, so that the audience knows that that's still happening. And as a consequence, it allows you to zero in then on the primary voice or the primary voices and to treat the other one as a kind of basso continuo or whatever it may be. So there were certain moments where that kind of thing was built right in. In general, however, the assumption here, since we came out of a long and slender tradition of radio that was very, very linear, was that one person spoke and then the other person spoke, and occasionally they interrupted each other by saying and or but that was about it, you know. And but certainly two did not speak together. That made no sense, and etc. And I, having grown up in that particular tradition and enjoyed its products hugely, nevertheless felt that this was always a great lack, that there was in the spoken word an absolute musical dimension which was being totally ignored, partly because, to a large extent, the rhythmic dimension was being ignored in the way in which it was very often, presented in the air. I think in the course of the Solitude trilogy, particularly in The Quiet and the Land, which, in my opinion, though nobody else's is the best of them, the clarity of what is being said contrapuntally is really as good as I can get it. I mean, I think if you can't hear it there, you're just not going to hear it, because there was no attempt made there, particularly to obscure one voice in favor of another. There is a much more even-handed, it's like the sort of Schoenberg third string quartet as opposed to the second. I mean, it's a much more even-handed attitude toward all speakers in those places where two or more do speak together, and by no means at all times do they do so. Subsequently, I've been sort of drafting an idea that I don't expect to really get to work on for another year or so, but at that point I expect to do a radio equivalent. I hope to do a radio equivalent of the Tala 64-voice motet, and don't intend to say anything more about that because it'll jinx the whole project if I do. But I personally think that it is not only possible, it is really rather easy and maybe even necessary in certain kinds of forms to concentrate simultaneously on at least two, and possibly more than two ideas which reflect and play off each other. I remember when Idea North was first done, the fashionable word was Aleatoric at that time. If you remember back to 1967. And one of the critics who first wrote about it dubbed it an Aleatoric radio show. Nothing could have been further from the truth.
Sure.
If ever there was a piece that was not conceived Aleatorically, that was it. And I sort of should have immediately contradicted that, but I didn't. I let it stand, and subsequently people began to talk about it in those terms. And so I sort of, more or less in the way of explaining what I really had in mind, stuck in at some point the word contrapuntal, meaning that for me, counterpoint is a very highly, or suggests a very highly organized discipline, which doesn't necessarily lead to a fugue in every instance, but in which every voice leads its own rather splendid life and adheres to certain specific parameters. And so I deliberately coined this term to counter the Aleatoric impression, because that was in fact the way I was working, with a very close eye to how the voices came together, in what way they splashed off each other, both in terms of the meaning of what they said, which could be construed as total contradiction one to the other, or total support, depending on the dramatic circumstances of the situation. But in any case, it was not done absent-mindedly, and just because the material happened to be lying around. But it never, for me, it never has seemed to be a problem. I must say, just parenthetically, in the penultimate sequence of the anniversary spoof, just before we go to the rig and the hysteric return, I did spoof a little bit, as you know, of the contrapuntal technique by having the two conversations simultaneously going on as to whether or not the Quiet on the Land was broadcastable. And the technique in those few seconds was identical to a great deal of the Quiet on the Land, where precisely that degree of complication is heard, and there's absolutely nothing in those, however many seconds are there, about 30, 35 seconds, I guess it is, that sequence, which is not completely understandable on both sides of the screen, I think. What else would you like me to say about it?
Well, that's fine.
Okay.
I think that handles it pretty well. I'd like to ask, just parenthetically, since we're discussing counterpoint in a medium which is not associated with counterpoint, have you ever seen D.W. Griffith's 1916 film called Intolerance?
Yes, I saw it once on a movie. I haven't seen it in the way of really concentrating and studying on it. I didn't, in fact, initially know. I came in late, but I saw the better part of it once years ago. I couldn't comment on it.
Iris Berry once called that the only film fugue, and it works very much that way. It starts off with different stories, and then by the ending you're down to maybe 6-7 frames from each story. There are 4 stories running simultaneously.
Yes.
I just thought I'd mention that very quickly. Also, could we talk a little about television, which, as a matter of fact, if I remember, you once yourself used the term aleatoric in the idea of television, if I remember right. Am I remembering correctly? You said the spontaneous, that you were most interested in television in the way it was in the early live days when it was spontaneous, and I think you used the term aleatoric.
Good Lord, did I say that?
I think so.
I'm getting somehow because I don't remember saying that. I hated live television. I did a lot of it, but I hated it.
Perhaps I'm misreading it. But
No, you may well be quoting something that was quoted, but it could also have been maybe quoted upside down and backwards. If I wrote it, I can't remember doing that. I think what I may have said, and I'm trying to remember, there was a period in the 60s when we were experimenting at the CBC with quite loose, seemingly open-ended formats for music presentation, because we were trying to find a way around the stereotyped sit down at the piano and play a sonata and get up and say a few words about the next one, presentation. And I may have, in that context, meant to say that perhaps it isn't necessary while hearing a Beethoven sonata or whatever it was, to not at the same time hear comment about it. And we did a few rather experimental things at that time along those lines, not all of which I think were very successful, but nevertheless they did attempt to break the mold, whatever the attempts were. It could be that I threw that word around very loosely, and if I did, I shouldn't have done so, because they, again, were simply attempts to give the illusion of great spontaneity, as opposed to careful, planning that goes into the conventional broadcast televised concert. But the actual carrying out of the thing was anything but casual and or unplanned. It was very planned,
Yes, it seemed, maybe I read it wrong, because it didn't seem to gel with
Exactly,
your
and
ideas.
so as a consequence, I think maybe I absent-mindedly may have used the word or something. Entirely possible. I don't remember doing it, but it's entirely possible that I did. But it wouldn't in any case, whether I did or not, what we did with that kind of well, at the moment, for example, in fact, most of today, and indeed in some panic most of this past week, because it's driving me crazy. I'm writing a television script on fugue, which we're going to tape next month. It's part of a series of 5 programs on Bach that I'm doing for a German company. Doing it here, but with a German producer and a French director. And I've been having a really hard time with this one because the rough guidelines are 40 minutes music, 20 minutes talk. Some of the talk goes over music, i.e. I might be sitting playing the counter subject to something or other while talking about it, But nevertheless, and that way I can sneak in a few more minutes of talk. But nevertheless, it is an absolutely impossible mission to try to deliver any important thoughts on the nature of fugue. I've been writing this bloody thing all week, going off in 16 different directions, trying to see which 3 or 4 of them could be harnessed together in some appropriate way. And as a result of this craziness, I still am not exactly sure what I'm even playing on the thing, and we're only 2 weeks away from taping it. I do know that there will be a kind of concert suite from the Art of the Fugue, which will end it, and that will be straight music, so that part is easy. But as a consequence, every time a new notion of how to describe some portion of the process comes along, a different piece strikes me as being appropriate, and I sooner or later, like in about 2 days, got to decide to stop this nonsense and but in any case, the conversation that I am writing takes place, or will take place, between the director and myself, and will appear to be completely spontaneous. It will be anything but. It will be a teleprompter and very carefully rehearsed and so forth and so on. It may have been nothing more than that kind of illusory impression that I was trying to characterize at that time, and it did so very maladroitly. That may be all it was.
I wish I could find the...
It could well just be something like that I was trying to describe. I'm just not sure.
I've enjoyed your own fugue writing. I must admit that I'm glad to have a new version of So You Want to Write a Fugue. That's really charming work.
That was fun. Well, that also was written for a CBC program many years ago, which, however, was somewhat easy to do because at that time it was a program that just took a look at 4 or 5 different or 6 different composers and 1 fugue from each and so forth and so on. But this one has to be within the confines of an ongoing discussion about Bach in various aspects. And I'm just finding this script very difficult. I'm not sure what the problem is, but it's been crazy.
I have a few more questions. I don't want to wear you out talking all this time. But before I ask these questions, my friend Paul Alexander has a couple questions which he'd like very much to ask you from sort of a different vantage point than the one which I'm coming from. So, can you hold on a sec?
Sure.
This is Paul Alexander.
Right.
Hi, Mr. Gould.
Hello, how are you?
I'm fine. I'm a composer, so I'll be asking you compositional questions.
Okay.
I'm curious, since you yourself are a composer, what do you think are the important issues confronting composers these days? What would you like to see the important issues be?
Well, my goodness, I don't know. I really don't know how to answer that question because I'm not sure that at any... all right, I guess there's one big issue that would not apply to today or to any particular time, but very much does apply to today, simply by virtue of the fact that there is a kind of super concentration of media curiosity, and that particular super concentration breeds incestuously, it seems, its own terrible zeitgeist problems. I would like to see a world in which absolutely nobody cared what the other person was doing, and in which the whole groupthink for 30 minutes, I'll do it for 31. The syndrome utterly disappeared. I just find that particular aspect, but I, one could have said exactly the same thing 20 years ago, simply about perhaps other tendencies or something. Specifically for that reason, I don't really have I haven't an axe to grind. I can't say to you I would like to see the reaffirmation of the tonal system in its original glory, and or I would wish to see a return to pure serialism in its moment of glory, or whatever. I haven't got an axe to grind. I would like to see a situation in which the particular pressures and polarizations that those systems engendered among their adherents and their opponents and so on just didn't exist. I suppose that's.
Well, that answers it, because as a fellow American, meaning a continental American,
right.
I'm always confused about our heritage, our culture, and the concerns, and there seems to be a lot of confusion about that, especially here in the New York music scene. So you go back to neoclassicism, romanticism, or dodecaphonic.
Well, I would think that the New York music scene would be a terribly difficult thing to be a part of unless one simply lived there and was quite specifically not a part of it in the way that I was talking to Tim a few minutes ago about other people who live isolated lives in other fashions. But I find it very depressing to hear about situations in which this very, very competitive, imitative notion of what is au courant and what is not, gives rise to what gets done. I mean, I just can't think of anything less important than that. And indeed, the whole... Well, right at the moment, I happen to be working on a Bach television program, which will take me a few weeks, and a large part of which is devoted to this Art Fugue. And for me, as for many other people I know, the great, marvelous, associative feelings that one has with the final Contrapunctus is that he was writing this against every possible prevailing tendency of the time, and that in itself, for me, becomes very moving. It shouldn't be moving. There's no more right to be moving than that the opposite has a right to be moving. That it was au courant to write a Scarlatti sonata or something. But nevertheless, somehow it does, and when you find that in the very end of his life, he really, even to a large extent, renounced the kinds of modulatory patterns that he himself used 6-7 years earlier in the Goldberg in Book 2 and so on, and was already writing a kind of whiter, less clearly defined early Baroque, late Renaissance, like modulatory scheme. I find that extraordinarily moving. That doesn't mean it's good or bad. It's just that he, finally at that point, said, "I don't care anymore. There are no more Italian concertos in me. This is what I'm about." And I suppose that is ideally the world as I would have it now or at any time. And as a consequence, it precludes my saying, well, what there ought to be is a return to pure Babbittism of 1959. I can't say that.
Right. Well, would you think that it's time for the arts to return to the epic form, to the monumental? It seems everybody's involved in these teeny tiny little pieces, ideas.
Yes, except that for, I guess, to state the most obvious example, Stockhausen has, for some years now, been thinking long, if not necessarily big,
Right.
And the Germanic side of his nature and of those who were influenced by him seems to have. I don't see. Well, again, you see, if you take a look, let's take a look at the year. Stick a pin in the map, 1913, or 1912, better still. You get Schoenberg doing Caro. You get Weber doing the little pieces that followed the string quartet pieces. Whichever ones they were, I never can remember say, if the world stopped at that moment, clearly the age of the epic is over, and we are now in a moment of fragmentation and of the breaking down of the idea of the great, long-breathed line of continuity in music. I simply cannot believe that would be an adequate summation of the year 1912, even though it would most certainly, in many histories, describe certain of its prevailing tendencies. Because also in the year 1912, you get Sibelius writing the Fifth Symphony, one of the first drafts of the Fifth Symphony, etc. And I don't think one needs to go any farther than that, just to point up the inherent absurdity of it all. So whether I find that it is really very disturbing to contemplate the lemming-like tendencies that artists in general, let's leave composers out of it exclusively, I mean, artists in general, have to assume that, as one of the characters in one of my docudramas said, the anti-hero is the thing that's in vogue this year, the hero will be back next. It just should not matter. One should be free of that, and I don't think that one really becomes content for one does until one is free of that. Again, it's a sort of question that in answering I would automatically betray my own views. If I said yes, it's now time for a return to the epic, that would implicitly convey the idea that at some recent point in the past there has been a time when it was not right to produce an epic.
Right.
And I can't see that should ever have necessarily been so, which does not at the same time mean that the Webern and post-Webern fragmentation wasn't in itself interesting and worthwhile and useful and any number of other things.
Right, okay. That more than answers that.
Okay.
Another question. This is kind of a technical question, I guess. The lead-in is the world's largest record store's entire inventory has tumbled off the Earth and is now floating through space. An extraterrestrial civilization has found the records and figured out how to play them. Which records will make their Billboard's top 10? Which records, or if you prefer musical idea types, contain enough of the work's content necessary for restoring the music's message? This is all in reference to your statement in the Pesant book that you detest the idea that art needs a great amount of information in order to properly value it. And I'm wondering what kind of music doesn't need that kind of information.
You'd have to quote that statement for me in more context than that. I'm not sure. I think what I said, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong, because maybe I was saying something quite different, but I think what I said was that one should be able to appreciate, I'll paraphrase, appreciate the art of fugue without knowing precisely in which way the inversions are taking place and etc.
It was taken out of context.
And that the actual data that goes into a particular reaction, the data even, and indeed perhaps most particularly including the identity of the artist, is terribly, terribly unimportant. And in fact, that it really constitutes a tremendous boon if you have no such data, if you do not know the name of the artist, if you cannot be impressed by a particular signature on a painting, if you cannot be excited by a particular tendency that is held to be germane and relevant and whatever else, in a musical work or whatever. But rather, if you react without knowing those things, I don't believe I ever meant to say that if you can avail yourself of the opportunity, it isn't useful and exciting and moving to observe that a particular augmentation or whatever is serving a special kind of function, a function above and beyond this function of being an augmentation, that is, and in some way motivating the structure in a way that would not happen were it not present. I don't think I ever meant to say that ignorance is bliss in that way. What I meant to say was that if you cut yourself off from those things that are supposed to inform you about the performance-like aspects of the creative act of composition, of painting, or whatever it may be. The performance-like in the sense of the execution-like acts. To cut yourself off from that kind of data and live in a world in which there is total anonymity, in which everybody is a Van Meegeren forging his Vermeer, sort of thing. I think that would be heaven. I mean, I personally would love that. Now, about that Billboard top 10 in outer space, I don't know. I think I refuse to answer.
Okay.
I don't even know how to go about that. I'll think about it. If the context in which I should think about it is that in outer space they are not prejudiced in that way and have no such knowledge, then there might, I suppose. Well, I can tell you right away. One composer who would never make it, except for the last pieces, and possibly a few of the first ones, is Beethoven. I mean, there is a composer whose reputation was based on gossip, if ever there was one. And, so I think the Grosse Fuge would make it. There's no question of that. But maybe even the Opus 18 quartets. But I don't think the Fifth Symphony would be up there in outer space. Not at all.
Okay. Well, this is another question which is kind of related to this. And it's something I've been wondering about. Acoustically, where does the scratch occur on your Sibelius recording? Does it occur foreground, midground, background? Or how would you describe the levels of a recorded music experience? Because there seems to be a lot of difficulty, at least in my ears, in listening to a record if the information is confused by noises on the record or noises in my home or something like that.
Are you talking about, quite specifically, you're literally using the word scratch in its...
Yeah, so a pop sound, a periodic pop sound of some kind. So that you actually have this foreground sound that's emanating from a record, especially as quiet as the Sibelius.
Right. I can only say that, and I hope this will be off the record, that I would not wish to be responsible for defending any particular company's services at any given time.
Yeah.
And I really don't think I should proceed beyond that, quite frankly. But I really... what was the question again? Maybe I can...
Well, the question, I might not have said it in its clearest manner. I'm wondering about imperfections in listening to a record.
Right.
And how you go about describing the levels of experiencing a record.
Well, I must tell you, I personally am just on a very practical level, I am a reel-to-reel tape person. I never listen to my own material. Well, I sort of do once and get depressed about it when it first gets released on a disc, and after that, never do, because I keep a copy of the master and play that for any friends who happen to drop in. If there's need to do that. On a reel-to-reel basis. And I just find the conventional disc at the present time one of the most depressing byproducts of what is otherwise a rapidly enhancing art form, But the disc lags so lamentably far behind in so many ways, not just in pops and cracks and scratches, but in groove echo and in groove distortion and in equalization, which has no part of the equalization plan of the original, but is there in order to equalize the band ratios as you go in and so on and so on. I just find it a very, if you know, I think it's fine if you pick up somebody else's record, I guess, and you don't know how good the tape might have been. If you do know your own and you then hear its final product, it's very depressing. But the last thing I could possibly do would be to defend a specific surface or whatever, because I'm not quite sure what I'm defending. I haven't ever listened to the Sibelius, but possibly once on a disc form, so I'm not sure what I'm defending.
I see. Well, one of the reasons I brought that question up, if I'm listening to a John Cage record,
yes,
I don't seem to mind the scratches.
Right.
And if I'm listening to a piece that's as delicate as the Sibelius sonatas, I'd almost prefer to be in the concert hall, where I know that person coughing behind me is part of the whole show, but the scratch on the record is a flaw that isn't part of it.
Well, if it helps, and if you would promise me that this is not on the record, I can tell you that I have for several years been making some very loud, I hope gracious, but nevertheless loud noises about my own feelings about record surface imperfections, because I'm very distressed about it, frankly. But I don't think it's something that I can discuss in print.
Oh, yeah, okay, no problem on that.
Okay.
Okay, well, I have a lot more questions, but I better turn you back over to...
Okay, well, it's been a great pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
Thanks. I don't want to take up too much more of your time. This is really going to be a superb interview.
Well, I'm looking forward to it very much. Your questions have been marvelous, and it's been. I must say, I love conducting interviews. I hate being interviewed. Always do. It's like going to the dentist for me. I don't know. Since I have the opportunity in the course of my work for CBC to see it from both sides of the fence, it's no fun at all. But this is an unexpected pleasure, and the questions have been so interesting that it sort of brought me alive, because I tend sometimes to sleep through interviews.
Oh, well, thanks so much. And if you ever want a random quote on Strauss.
Listen, if I do another documentary, I will certainly get to you, absolutely.
One of the things which is most interesting to me, the tape's about to run out. Let me just make a change of tape, okay? Okay, here we go. We should be recording now. One of the things which I have respected most about your career is the fact that when you buy a recording that you've made or a work, say a docudrama or an article that you've written, you haven't just bought a record or a docudrama or an article. You've actually bought something where your personality comes through. It's a Glenn Gould work. And I think this may be one of the reasons that people got so frustrated at the beginning, because you always refused to be a mere finger wiggler and sit up there and just play the piano without actually thinking. It's again almost like the Faustian idea behind it. In this way, your career reminds me somewhat of the career of Busoni, who was also another musician with great gifts, who was fascinated by the idea behind the music rather than just getting up there and doing it. Would you say that's true?
I would certainly say that's true of Busoni. I think it would be improper for me to comment as to whether the parallel is in any way exact, but it would certainly say it's true of Busoni, yes.
I certainly do see that in your work, though. It's really like you do get a record that is somebody buys that is one of your records is more than just a record. It's a Glenn Gould record. You've often... I don't want to make it sound like you do something differently, just deliberately to be different, but you have said that the only excuse for recording something is to do it differently.
Yes, I think that is true. I think, however, that I've always tried to, sometimes I've not gotten my parenthetic qualifier in there fast enough, but I have always meant, anyway, to immediately interject that if, however, that difference that occurs to you hasn't anything of validity musically, organically to recommend it, then better not to record the work, you know.
Sure, of course.
And I must say that I am by no means without stain in this regard, because there have been works that I have recorded simply for the sake of completeness, about which I have no convictions whatsoever, because I don't like them. You know?
Can you, would this be some of the Mozart piano sonatas?
A couple of the later Mozart sonatas. The early ones I love, the middle ones I love, the later ones I do not like. I really, as I think I said in my program notes, find them absolutely intolerable, quasi-theatrical conceits. Mm-hmm. And I can certainly say that I went about recording something like Kershel 570, for example, late B-flat major, with no conviction whatsoever, you know. But I'll go even further and go even into something more current. Just last week, I was recording a digital session of two Haydn sonatas. We were at the moment recording all of the late Haydn sonatas, and
which I love. I adore Haydn, early, middle, and late. But nevertheless, there are, amidst these incredible adventures, which are his piano sonatas, which have, in many cases, no concept of what was expected, what was required, what was approved, what the other guys were doing. They are just unique, you know. Mm-hmm. Nevertheless, there are some real clinkers. And we have been attempting, we're planning to do the last half dozen or so in a chronological fashion, more or less. And as a consequence, I guess it's the penultimate one, I don't remember, 61, is a little two-movement sonata in D major, which I find awfully hard to believe was written as late as all the scholars claim it was. Its first movement seems to me as though it were resurrected from someplace in the early 1770s instead of mid-1790s. But anyway, which doesn't necessarily make it bad. It's just that it seems the kind of rather absent-minded thing he occasionally tossed off earlier on. The little second movement does have a great deal of contrapuntal intensity, and that suggests the later Haydn to me. But anyway, that first movement, I did 5 takes of it in 2 completely different tempo molds. It's the first time in a long while I have been that purposeless. I just didn't know what I wanted to do with that silly piece, and refused to dignify it by spending very much time thinking about it before I went there. But in order to keep the sequence going, it had to be included. And I suppose the really proper answer, the answer is one should have just omitted it and said we will now have 58, 59, 60, 62, or whatever. But unfortunately, there are chronological sequences that look very nice on record covers sometimes, and one gets into these things. So I can give you a very up-to-date example of that particular lack of conviction. However, I don't think it brought about anything very unusual in the particular realization of that word. Maybe it did. I've never heard the word played, so I don't know if it did or not.
I actually don't think I will be publishing this. I have no idea what answer you're going to give me, but I'd like to ask this just for my own curiosity. A record that Columbia is about to release, I have it here in cassette form, is called The Little Bach Book. And I'm in some ways really quite, I haven't seen any program notes, so I don't know if there was a concept behind the album, except for sort of a Bach's greatest hits type thing. But I'm very interested that somebody like yourself, who of all pianists has the strongest respect for the architecture of, say, something like the partitas or a major work by Bach, would allow a movement to be excerpted, like the 2 minuets and the concluding movement. Is that Columbia, or is that you, or how do you feel about that? I just love to get some ideas.
Well, my goodness, how can I say this without mentioning any names? The record has nothing to do with me other than the comment.
I suspected that. I just wanted to...
Things. And I did loan them. I did find them a picture taken at the age of 11 sitting at the piano, because it was aimed at kids who have to play certain movements as part of their study courses usually, and they picked all the most popular minuets and whatever, and or at least not all, but quite a few of them. And I didn't have anything to do with the selection. The one thing that I did participate in, when they told me which ones they wanted to include, I said, okay, if you're going to include X number of inventions, at least they've got to be in something like descending fifths, a key order, and let me at least rearrange, put them in that order, something of that nature.
Well,
that was my entire input into that record.
I suspected this.
That and loaning them the cover picture.
I suspected this. However, if you come up with a brilliant defense about it, I might have included it, but I'm not going to embarrass you by mentioning that in the interview and getting you in any kind of hot water.
No, I'd rather you didn't, because I'm sure that some kiddie someplace will find it useful, and that's good. And but I had nothing to do with it.
Yeah, ordinarily you don't like the idea, I assume.
No, although let me put it this way: on my Bach Fugue show next month, I have been arguing for some months now with the director in Paris about the inclusion of preludes from the WTC, and I have finally and very reluctantly agreed to play one in conjunction with an accompanying fugue, because I really feel that a great many of the WTC preludes and fugues are better served when heard alone than they are heard together, that they have absolutely nothing to do with each other, even though in many instances, we know that Bach, put them together, presumably not entirely carelessly. But I find that some of the greatest fugues are, for example, we decided that within the course of this show we should dissect one fugue in great detail. Spent about 10 minutes just pulling it apart for the listener. And the fugue that I chose to do that to was the E major from the second book, which for me is one of the great Renaissance holdovers. That incredible Richard Carré.
Yeah.
And that thing, as you probably remember, comes equipped with not a bad piece at all, but just a rather, by comparison, worldly little binary. And I really don't see the emotional connection between those two movements. So help me, I can't, And it seemed that the director felt very strongly about the fact that since I was spending so much time talking about this fugue, I really should, play the prelude with it, because I'm going to play the fugue twice before we talk about it and at the end of that particular sequence. And I said, if you insist, I'll do it, but I think that's just weakening the structure. So if that is in any way indicative, I don't think there's any great problem for me in isolating a saraband or something. I think possibly one might view minor suspicion, the commercial use to which is being put in this particular instance, but the idea of swapping, for example, I think I once suspected that one could transpose, let's say, the saraband from the C minor Bach partita and put it into the A minor, and there would be very little damage done. I think there are certain, one could not, for example, transpose the one from the C minor and put it into the E minor and say there'd be no damage done, because the scale and the sense of drama and the sense of utterly stern, gray mood of the E minor is so special, and even within the Bach canon that one couldn't do that. But I don't see. I very often sit down and just for myself play a movement or something without playing the entire work necessarily. So I don't see that the excerpt per se is terrible and damaging. I'm not deeply disturbed about it. However, it wouldn't have been the kind of album that I would have thought of doing on my own.
Yeah, it somehow didn't bear your stamp.
No, I don't think it really does.
I'd like to talk just for a moment about some contemporary trends in new music, as you've spoken quite often about various ideas in new music. I was interested to find out in the Jonathan Cott work that you don't sound like you like Berio very much. As a matter of fact, I came back from a Berio work this evening.
Oh, really?
Yeah, something called Chorus, which was not very interesting, I didn't think. I'm curious to find out whether you have heard any of the music of some of the people who are often called the minimalist composers.
You mentioned this in your letter, and the answer to it is, I gather that you've had a lot of experience with this music, and I have had very little encounter with it, except the obvious kind that I, someplace in the late 60s, was the only person I knew who actually sat through in C without blinking. Similarly, Stimmung, which I found quite restful. But
did you like it in C, curiously?
I used it in the context, oddly, of a documentary about Casals. I actually incorporated it in between the exposition recapitulation of the Beethoven 8th Symphony. How that came about, you would have to hear Casals screaming about contemporary music and how he hated it at that moment to realize what was being done to Beethoven and to Terry Riley. But
may I send you some records?
Certainly, or if you tell me what I should hear, I will hear. I will, however, tell you a little story, if I may, which will perhaps make my relation to all this clearer. You are much too young to, I know that because I read your dossier, you're much too young to go back to the days when upstanding North American citizens had things called victory gardens. But they did during the war, and I remember one particular experience which became seminal for me because it subsequently explained to me years later why it was that I could never accompany a Schubert lead without wanting desperately to break out of a ya-da-dee-da-da-dee-da-da-da-dee-da-da-da-da-da and do ya-da-da-da-da or something. Well, anyway, the experience was that when I was 9 years old, this taking place in 1941, or 42, I guess it was, we had neighbors who were passionate about their victory garden. And they had kids who were my playmates in those days, who were indefatigable workers. I mean, little beavers, they really worked. And I was not exactly the most industrious kid on the block. In any case, this particular neighbor was so fanatic about his victory garden that he leased from a farmer, I don't know, it seemed like acres, but it probably wasn't more than half of one, outside of Toronto. And one, I guess it was Saturday afternoon anyway, one weekend afternoon, I, along with his three kids, who were my playmates, was taken out, was handed a hoe or rake and told to go to work. And I suddenly discovered that any repetitive movement made me go absolutely weak in the knees. I mean, I couldn't stand it. It was utterly impossible for me to do the same thing twice without some variation, which of course got the potato rows all fouled up. And I found that the only recourse was to start laughing rather hysterically, which I did. Hysterical not in a clinical sense, but I just found the whole thing terribly funny, and it was my only response to the situation. Whereupon I demoralized the troops, alias the three kids and the neighbors, who all started laughing, and we all started falling down in the road of potatoes, with the war effort being jeopardized no end, and the neighbor getting absolutely apoplectic and furious. And from that moment on, I had built-in experience which later explained why I could never play a Schubert lead or any other kind of repetitive thing. I simply go absolutely up the wall. However, oddly, if I simply sit quietly, listen to Stimmung or something, I don't find that to be so much of a problem. I don't, however, find it, because of the specific repetitive nature, something that I particularly have been able to relate to. But if you will be so kind as to tell me what I should listen to, I will certainly do it.
If you'd like, I'll send you a couple articles in addition on the music as well as the record.
That'd be wonderful. I'd love that. Absolutely.
Well, I'd be delighted to do that. Is there anyone composing now who you're very interested? Are you interested in any of the the post, the so-called post-Webern composers, who I personally think have sort of taken Webern's ideas with none of the passion, at least most of them, not all of them, obviously. But are you interested in any of the music of somebody like, Pierre Boulez or Charles Warren or...
Well, I don't know whether... when you hear the tape, I assume that when I was talking to Mr. Alexander, we were taping in the same way.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Although he didn't mention those names, I didn't mention those names either. I was, in fact, talking about post-Webern serialism as opposed to, not minimalism, certainly, but what we were talking about was my inability to be able to react to... I don't know if I can say this all over again, inability to be able to react to a situation in which a zeitgeist-compelled tendency suggests that a particular motivation is adequate and appropriate for more than one individual at a time.
In other words, the whole
yes.
Historically inevitable business.
And I actually, talked at some length about this to him. And
well, then there's no reason to go into it.
Though he doesn't specifically talk about Pierre Boulez, or any more than it does about Webern, for that matter. Although I think, I did talk about Webern briefly, come to think, but in passing. But we specifically talked about, my notion of how anonymity plays a role in all of that, or should, rather than how it does. And so I think you'll find that maybe what you want is there.
Well, that sounds fine. I want to really thank you tremendously.
It's been a pleasure. I really enjoyed it. It's been utterly painless and great fun, and I would look forward to the articles on the the minimalist. And if you will simply suggest to me which records I should hear, I will make a point of hearing them.
Well, I can certainly have them sent to you.
No, just give me a couple of records you think are most appropriate, and I will certainly make sure.
Okay, I'd be delighted to. I'd also like to, if possible, set something up where we could talk briefly.
Sure.
We won't need to talk at this length. Can I call you in maybe a couple weeks and leave a message?
And I'll get back. And needless to say, at that time, I will be getting very close to the filming that I was telling you about, so I won't have as much time. But we can certainly just go over whatever questions you have outstanding or whatever.
Well, that's splendid. Should I give you my address also on the...
Oh, yes, certainly, please.
Because I'd be very interested in
I'll
this.
get the idea of North too, and if I can find an extra copy of the... Well, as a matter of fact, you said you're meeting Jonathan Cott.
Yes, I'm going to
He has got a... Do you have a reel-to-reel system? Or nobody these days does. It's amazing. But in any case, he has got a reel-to-reel copy of which is all I could send you. I don't have it converted of the Strauss documentary since he's in it.
Oh, I'd love
and in fact, he did have. Wait a minute, he did have it converted to cassette, and in fact, the person who converted it for him had the cassette run out just before the closing credits. So he's got all but about. You have to imagine the closing credits occur over the horn solo in Beim Schlafengehen. And he may not have that, and you just have to assume that it's there and it fits. And when she comes back in with yada, everything is right on schedule, and the credits are fitted exactly that 1 minute and 3 seconds or whatever it is. But yes, let me take your address.
I should mention that I don't know if you remember him, but he wanted to pass on his very best to you. Leonard Altman. He was involved in a number of things. For a while, he was at the New York State Council on the Arts. Before that, he was at Leeds on
yes,
music, and he said he got a lot of interesting music for you.
Absolutely, he certainly did. I mean, please give him my very best.
He sends his very best wishes. So.
Thank you so much.
Well, listen, thanks again for a splendid interview. I'm beginning to talk like Theodore Sludge here.
You know what? Thank you for never way to talk like Theodore Sludge, because like he's a pretty original guy, and
it's been a real pleasure.
It certainly has, and take care, and I'll look forward to hearing from you in a couple of weeks or whenever.
And I'll send you a copy of some of the articles, and we'll talk in a couple of weeks.
Wonderful.
Thanks again, Glenn.
Thanks very much. Bye.
Good night.
The Glenn Gould Foundation is a registered Canadian charity, and we rely on the support of arts lovers like you to keep bringing inspiring stories to life. Please consider giving by visiting our website, glenngould.ca, and follow us across social media at the Glenn Gould Foundation. Thank you so much for joining us for this episode of the Gould Standard.